Hi class, welcome back to Biomedical Ethics. Today we're going to be talking about how new biotechnologies, several of which we've already discussed in class, are being applied for environmental purposes. In particular, we'll be talking about the de-extinction debate, where we can literally bring species back to life. Now, this is exciting for many reasons, and many supporters argue that this is wonderful for conservation and for ecosystem services to ensure that they function, but it also brings up many ethical issues, as we'll be talking about today. And so class will be structured as follows. We'll be talking about why this is an issue, and we're living in or through one of the greatest extinction events to occur in Earth prior to or post the extinction of the dinosaurs, so to speak. That time period that we all learned about and enjoyed um, discussing when we were children. And then we'll be talking about how biotechnology is being applied in specific ways to bring species back. And we'll be, of course, talking about the ethical issues. And so we're living in the age of the Anthropocene or the Anthropocene. And this is the current geological age where human activity is the dominant influence on climate and the environment. And so even at the poles of our Earth, of the planet, we can see human impacts on large systems that were once thought beyond the control or at least the influence of humanity. So humans today are considered the apex of apex predators, and we're responsible for introducing invasive species to fragile ecosystems. We hear about this all the time, especially in the Pacific Northwest. Hunting fauna to extinction, as we did throughout the ages, and introducing a large amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, especially since the Industrial Revolution. And what's interesting here is Alexander von Humboldt, who was the teacher of Charles Darwin, wrote in some of his letters to other colleagues that he was worried about humans' impact on weather systems and on the environment. And so we've been talking about how humans are impacting these larger ecosystem services for a very long time, especially if we look at von Humboldt's work. But today it's become a pressing topic, especially when we see wide range impacts, or we're seeing the realities of these impacts. And so in 1992, over 1,700 scientists drafted the World Scientists' Warning to Humanity, and they argue that overpopulation, increasing greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, overfishing, etc., was setting us on the path to another mass extinction. So fast forward to today, and right now we're losing up to 10,000 species a year, and I'm just pulling from some of the current numbers that we're seeing and some of the research being published in Science and Nature. And so the current extinction rate is 10 to 100 times higher than previous mass extinctions. And so we're losing many species at a very prodigious rate. And so the past 100 years, we're seeing 400 vertebrate species going extinct, and this would have taken roughly 10,000 years prior. In addition, amphibians are being hit quite hard, where estimates range wildly between 50 and 70% of our amphibian species being threatened due to these mass extinctions. And so certain categories of flora and fauna are getting impacted more than others. But regardless, the number of extinction events is increasing dramatically. And so I'm not going to show you this video, but it is available to you. We've been talking about extinction for a very long time, and extinctions, hence Charles Darwin, right? And extinctions have been occurring, and they occur regularly. And so in ecology and in biology, it's the end of an organism or a group of organisms, a taxon, normally of species, right? And so this is something that happens, especially when we look at how evolution works. So, what's the big deal here? Especially if 99% of all species that once lived on Earth have gone extinct. And, this seems to be a regular occurrence. We can probably all name a particular species that have gone extinct. So the Basilosaurus, for example, is one of my favorites, and we no longer have bassies swimming our oceans. So, why should we think that causing or permitting the extinction of species is a bad thing? And, so what are some of the recent extinctions? And I'd love for you to talk about this in your discussion forums. So, is it a bad thing? Or is it simply letting nature take its course, so to speak? Well, we're going to talk about this. So, bracketing that question, and we will come back to that question in a little bit, actually, when we talk about the ethics of de-extinction. Many important species have gone extinct recently. So let me give you some examples. The golden toad. It was last spotted in Monteverde, Costa Rica in 1989, and it is now extinct. No more golden toads have been found there or anywhere else. We have the passenger pigeon. We literally ate this one to extinction. So it was one of the most populous birds in North America. It could fly 60 miles an hour. Their numbers were wiped out after Europeans arrived and hunted them for cheap meat. And so in 1914, the last passenger pigeon died in the Cincinnati Zoo. Now, it's fascinating to read some of the early reports of passenger pigeons. At one point, their flocks were so large that they blacked out the sun. And they were so numerous that people didn't realize that they had gone extinct or that they were going extinct until it was too late to revive the species. One of the wonderful things about passenger pigeons, and then we'll move on, so that they clean out underbrush. So they are very important for mitigating forest fires. Just a side note. And this is one of the reasons why researchers are working to bring back passenger pigeons. Then we have the Tasmanian tiger. And the last one passed away in a zoo in 1936. And so many of you might have seen Tasmanian tigers, at least the cartoon version of a Tasmanian tiger. But they are extinct, and it was a relatively recent one. The Caspian tiger was hunted to death. It was lived for more than 10,000 years. And its range was along what's called the Silk Road. But during the 19th century, the Russian army was ordered to exterminate the tigers as part of an agricultural project, and they were very successful in doing so. So it took them a bit, but by 1970, there are no more Caspian tigers. The Pierian ibex. No one's really sure what happened with the ibex, but the numbers started dwindling relatively recently, and the species was declared extinct in 2000. And they were commonly found between Spain and France in the mountain regions there. And so species gone extinct in 2020 include, and I'm just pulling some of the numbers here, 32 orchid species in Bangladesh alone, 65 North American plants, 22 frog species, and this is from Science, the journal, 15% of mite species, 17 freshwater fish from Lake Launo, Madano, in the Philippines. I'm butchering the pronunciations, but 17 freshwater fish species in the Philippines alone have gone extinct, and the list just goes on and on. And if you're interested, there are lists yearly listing the tally. And so de-extinction is an application of biotechnologies to help address, or as a last step, last gasp method of helping to bring species back when we do not want them to go extinct. And so de-extinction is the process by which humans genetically engineer embryos to bring back extinct relatives. It's not Jurassic Park. It is definitely something that researchers are working on. And so they're resurrecting extinct species by genetic methods. And there are three plausible methods for resurrecting extinct species. One, we could clone them, and we talked about the power of cloning, or utilizing somatic cell nuclear transfer. And so here, a cell nucleus from a well-preserved tissue sample of an extinct species is inserted into an enucleated ovum of a female of a related species. And so the cell will carry almost precisely the genome of the extinct species and is induced to replicate and inserted into the female uterus. And then if the pregnancy is successful, the gestational parent will give birth to an offspring of the extinct species. So that's relatively straightforward. One of the big issues includes one, the just the failure rate of cloning. Cloning is still, well, it's much better than it was when Dolly was cloned, but it still has a very high failure rate. And so, do we have a large tissue sample? Um, and is it ethical or acceptable to clone with such a large failure rate? Two, some species, the gestational parent needs to be large enough to gestate the extinct species. So this is currently an issue that people are having with mammoths, that there is no elephant species large enough currently to gestate a mammoth or to bring a mammoth to term. And so this is an issue with this, but for other species, it might very well be a path that we can take. And indeed, it is one that is being utilized, as we'll see. And so we could also genetically engineer. And so when we do have well-preserved cell nuclei, but when we don't have well-preserved cell nuclei, but we have DNA fragments, from many different specimens, they can be sequenced and then spliced into the genome of a closely related species. And so here, this is what's occurring as we'll talk. This is genetic engineering is the approach that researchers are using to bring back the mammoth, or to hopefully bring back the mammoth, because they do not have a well-preserved cell nuclei at the moment. So we have cloning, we have genetic engineering, and then of course we have selective breeding. And this is turning the species most closely related to the extinct one to the extinct species, excuse me. And so to bring about different phenotypic changes that are like the extinct species. And so this is a very large, and it's a very large commitment, and it is a long process. And it would only, of course, work with certain species, one, and two, we could always question whether or not, say, the end result is indeed the extinct species, or simply a modified version of the species that we began the process with. So we have cloning, we have genetic engineering, and we have selective breeding. And all three, as I said, are being used today. So the ibex is being cloned. Currently, there's research being done to bring back the ibex utilizing cloning. Both the passenger pigeon and the Tasmanian devil, there are research programs aimed at bringing them back through genetic engineering. And of course, the mammoth as well is being brought back through genetic engineering, and they're coming closer and closer to bringing the mammoth back. And so I'm not going to show you this video, but actually I do want to stop here. What do you think? Okay, one, which approach do you think should be the one that we use? are there any ethical issues or concerns about any of the three? And two, should all species be brought back? So we have, for example, with genetic engineering, we're bringing back the passenger pigeon, the Tasmanian tiger, and the mammoth, or potentially bringing them back. Should we bring the mammoth back? What are some of the issues that you foresee here? Is it ethical to bring the mammoth back or not to bring the mammoth back? And what criteria would you use to determine which species should be brought back? I mean, already we're only like 5 minutes into the lecture, and there are so many questions, right? And so this would also be a wonderful piece for you to discuss in the discussion forums. And I'm very much interested in what you guys are thinking and whether or not you think the mammoth should be brought back. So, should we bring them back? Well, the Cohen reading provides 5 dimensions of the ethics of de-extinction. And so it is actually a very complicated question to answer. And one could argue that it really depends on the species. So Cohen's 5 dimensions include 1, the possible contribution of de-extinction to promoting ecological values. And so why are we bringing back a species? Are we bringing back a species like Jurassic Park, although that's impossible, but to create a park for our amusement? Or are we bringing a species back, say, like the passenger pigeon, that could fill an ecological niche to help ecosystems function better? So the deontological argument that we owe de-extinction to species we rendered extinct. So if we're living in the Anthropocene, and we had some sort of hand in an extinction, or let's say with the passenger pigeon, we did, eat the passenger pigeon to extinction. Do we have an ethical duty then to bring the passenger pigeon back? And does that ethical duty say, if we recognize it, does that trump, so to speak, our desire to bring back other species? And so the deontological argument that we owe de-extinction to species we rendered extinct. Well, do we? And what does that mean? What do we owe then? 3, the question of playing God through de-extinction. And so evolution is a very complex process. And do we know enough? Do we know enough to take the power of evolution into our own hands? Or are we setting ourselves up for folly? The utilitarian perspective, will it produce the greatest good for the greatest number? And 5, the role of aesthetic considerations in the ethics of de-extinction. So we'll largely focus on the first 3, especially since the 4th one we've been applying utilitarian ethics all throughout the semester, so you all are very, very familiar with that. And aesthetic considerations fall outside of the purview of bioethics, although it is a very important area of consideration. So we have the possible contribution of de-extinction to promoting ecological values, the argument that we've impacted these species, so we have a duty somehow, and the question of playing God or taking evolution in our own hands. And so first, ecological values. Well, in environmental ethics, environments have value. And so, for example, Aldo Leopold, in the early 1920s, he was one of the fathers of the science of ecology. In his landmark work called the Sand County Almanac, he argued that when we see land as a commodity to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. And so this was radical in his day. He was essentially saying that the environment is more than simply a finite set of resources. The environment is an interconnected web that we rely upon for our own survival. And as such, we need to think about how our actions influence or impact this ecological web because it would, spell our doom. We are indeed part of a larger system. And so this kicked off discussions not only in the new ecological sciences of the time and wildlife management. He was one of the first professors of wildlife conservation and management at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. But it also pushed us to think more deeply about how our actions will impact our quality of life and future generations. And so, in this way, environments very much have value. And in fact, prior to Aldo Leopold, we also see discussions of environmental value by John Muir, who was one of the first environmentalists in the country, and he founded the Sierra Club. And Gifford Pinchot, our first forestry what is it, Minister of the Interior, the first gentleman who was in charge of ensuring that our forests are properly managed. And he argued that we should manage our forests in such a way to do the greatest benefit for the greatest number for the longest time. And so looking toward future generations that our environmental lands should be managed in such a way to continuously benefit others. And so this is just a very quick discussion of environmental values and how environmental ethics has informed our view of wild areas from the 1900s, moving into our current de-extinction discussion. And so fast forward to Stone in the 1970s, and he wrote an influential piece called Should Rivers Have the Same Legal Rights as Humans? And so we started to see natural areas at least gaining traction in the legal context. And so our courts do recognize that environments have value. Today, although there's quibble about standing, but again, that is for another class. And so let's return to de-extinction and the environment. So the primary ethical argument for de-extinction is its potential contribution to the environment, to promoting biodiversity. And in fact, when you watch some of the popular videos on de-extinction, when you read some of the pieces for this week, almost every supporter will point towards conservation, that de-extinction is important because we're losing a lot of species, and some of these species are what's called keystone species. And keystone species play a particularly important role in our ecosystems to ensure that they function well. And so, if we're losing species, one way to address this, to ensure that the niche is not emptied, is to reintroduce or de-extinct the species that we've lost, to maintain biodiversity, to ensure ecosystem functioning, and to ensure that our native species are thriving. And so I'm going to stop here for a second. That seems like a very strong argument. What do you think? Do you think that the environmental argument is strong enough to support bringing species back? And again, should this hold for all species, or is the environmental argument only strong for certain species? And so again, there's so many questions, right? So we know that we've had discussions over the last 100 years about how we should value the environment. And here we're working to bring species back, and we're utilizing environmental values to support the claims that we should, but should we bring them back? So that's the environmental movement, the environmental argument. Now, there are a couple of critiques, as we saw in the reading. One, de-extinction isn't always ecologically valuable. So just to give you an example, in the picture on the left, Those are lionfish. Lionfish are invasive and they are essentially eating their way around Florida and decimating the reefs down there because they have an insatiable appetite. One female, she can lay upwards of 3,000 eggs per spawn, and they lay their eggs in deep water, so it's really difficult to stop them from hatching. And they are also covered in spikes, and so you need to go down to remove them with a spear. Like scuba divers need to literally like jump into the water in order to remove the lionfish. And so they're making their way north as far as they can get with the temperatures, and also south, and they've already made it out down to the coast of Brazil. And so, what would happen if we brought back a species and the species became invasive? And so, introducing a species might not lead to increased biodiversity, and indeed, worst case scenario, it might lead to decreased biodiversity. And so, it can be argued that extinction is absolutely normal, the necessary mirror phenomenon. Speciation, an estimated 99.9% of species have disappeared, and de-extinction is therefore natively wrong-headed. And so this is the second argument. The first one was, it's not always ecologically valuable. We could have issues like the lionfish. We could have invasive species that are ecologically harmful. And I just want to note, the lionfish in their natural range are balanced with other species. It's only when they were introduced outside of their range that we have an issue. And that was thought that people had them as pets and then decided they didn't want them and then dumped them in the ocean, and here we are. Now, the second concern is one that we just talked about a couple of minutes ago. Extinctions happen. And so, why are we upset about a natural occurrence occurring? It seems like this isn't an ethical issue, it's simply an ecological issue, and we shouldn't be so worried about it because new species will take the old species' place and we'll be fine. And so the counter argument to this is that this particular extinction is not natural because we're living in the Anthropocene. And so many of these extinctions have been human triggered. For example, again, the passenger pigeon, but many others beyond the passenger pigeon have been human triggered. And so humans, we're using a lot of the world's resources, we're overfishing, we're expanding our influence, and this in turn, this larger footprint is negatively impacting many species, bringing many of them, or at least some of them, to extinction. And so one could argue that extinctions caused by human encroachment don't fit in the natural turnover of species based on the survival of the fittest. And so again, do we have a duty? That goes back to the second point that Cohen made. So do we have a duty to de-extinct the species that we intentionally caused to go extinct? Now, Cohen goes on to argue that the argument against de-extinction would have to go as follows. If nature has intrinsic value, this value must entail independence from human purpose, activity, and interest. Humans cannot restore natural intrinsic value, since all restoration qua human creation is artificial, and it hence ipso facto loses all intrinsic value. And so Cohen's argument is that, well, wait, like if we de-extinct a species, then it becomes an artifact. It's not natural. And so only natural regions that haven't been influenced by humans are natural. And so humans can't restore natural intrinsic value. And so we should just leave it as it is because we're really just creating facsimiles. But does this hold? I mean, this seems like an odd view, at least personally, but I'm curious what you guys think. Does, human impact to a natural world uh, turn it into not a natural thing, but an artificial thing, right? And so are recreated or de-extinct species, are they now technologies and not, say, species, and thus losing their intrinsic value? That seems to be a very strong claim there. And so the counter argument then is that this extinction isn't natural because we're influencing the natural world. We have a duty to protect it. But then the counter argument is that, well, we've impacted it essentially, and so it loses all value, which seems odd. And so this is what Cohen calls the paradox of trying to preserve what we cannot, or turning nature, as I said, into an artifact. And so is preserving the environment beyond our ability? And is preservation turning the environment into an artifact? Because that, like I said, is a very strong position. So this is something else that we could talk about in the discussion forum this week. So much to talk about. And so this is a wrong-headed critique, Cohen goes on to argue, built on the concept of humans as separate from nature. But imagine, he goes on to argue, for instance, that seeds of a certain bush attached to the shoe of a foreign traveler that gets spread to a new land, integrating into the local flora. Then does the human vehicle per se make this species an artifact in its new habit? Or if we clear hiking trails on a mountain slope, does the slope become an artifact? Or if indeed we have human induced changes to climate, then does everything that human induced change to climate change, does that then turn the world into one large artifact rather than, say, as something of natural or environmental value? And so this is called a reductio ad absurdum, and it's pushing back against this sort of idea that if we touch something or if we impact it, then it becomes an artifact. And so what do you think about the argument and the counter argument here, especially concerning changing climate? Then we have other criticisms. And so even when de-extinction is ecologically beneficial, is this the best way to use resources? I mean, we have conservation projects where we're trying to ensure that species do not go extinct. And so rather than spending all the time and the mountain of money in order to bring species back, shouldn't available funds be better spent on much cheaper conservation efforts of the roughly 20,000 endangered species? And so, as with the lionfish, too, ecosystem functioning and native species integrity could be impacted. And so we have biodiversity versus integrity here, and we have concerns both over whether it's the best use of resources and concerns about whether or not we're ensuring ecosystem integrity with an eye towards biodiversity. So we're increasing the numbers of species, but is that always a good thing? All right. So, two, we have the restorative justice argument. And so this is the idea that humans are responsible for the majority of extinctions, at least the current ones. And so we have a duty to right these wrongs. But do we have a duty to right the wrongs, right? So let's see. So justice clearly plays a role in arguments for why the passenger pigeon is being brought up. And researchers are very concerned that we caused this extinction. And so we should bring the passenger pigeon back. But is it a matter of justice? So David Hyde argued that Efforts to protect those species about which we feel guilty for having endangered them to the point of extinction. Obviously, this priority cannot be considered a matter of justice. And so Hyde is arguing that we simply feel guilty for impacting certain species, and so we feel like we should bring them back, but it's not a matter of justice because we have duties to individuals. We have duties to individual people, and if we treat an individual person badly, we could argue and that it's clearly an injustice, especially when we are impacting them in a way that is guided by bias, or where the harms are inordinately placed on the shoulders of a group. So we have duties to communities as well. But do these recognized duties to individuals and communities, can that be applied to species and taxonomic entities? So can we say that we have a duty to a species? How can species have rights here, right? Because individuals have rights. Even pulling from the Declaration of Independence that I like to talk about, with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And communities certainly can have rights. But species seems like that's a different type of thing, right? That's a category. Can a category have rights? And so what do you think? Now, philosophers are rightly torn on the topic. So, pulling from Ronald Dworkin, a pretty famous philosopher, he argues that we consider it a kind of cosmic shame when a species that nature has developed ceases through human actions to exist. And John Rawls declares that the destruction of a whole species can be a great evil. But for an entity to be morally considerable, it needs to have interests that are wrong to impede, because of the intrinsic value of the being, right? And so individuals have values, they have rights because they're valuable in and of themselves. I mean, to pull from Bernie Rollin, Tom Reagan. Tom Reagan argued that animals who are subjects of a life have rights because they're subjects of a life, because they can feel pleasure and pain, because they have self-directed behavior, and they have wants and needs and desires. And so there's that intrinsic value argument, and can a species be wronged here? And as we saw, ethical decisions or discussions concern the identification of key priorities, such as Reagan's argument that a species of a life has specific properties that garners that species to have intrinsic value. And for Kant, it was reason. Humans are intrinsically valuable because we can guide our lives and make choices, and that places beings in the moral sphere. And so we talked about these properties throughout the semester, but does this hold for, say, a species, for that type of category, or does it not? And so Pell argued that it's not that difficult to argue that a category has rights. And so if a species doesn't have goal directedness, then it's hard to see why they might have morally relevant interests. But we have seen times when entities will have moral status. And so, for example, political philosophy recognizes group rights, or rights given to a group rather than an individual. So if individuals have rights because they possess morally relevant properties, then groups of these individuals also possess these rights. And so we could argue that, say, for a species, it's not the category, it's not the taxonomic unit itself that ensures that it has rights or that it is valuable. Rather, it's the individuals that make up that unit. And so the individual if the individuals or the individual members of a species are valuable, then the grouping, the species itself, the taxonomic unit, would be valuable too. And so we simply need to pull a page from political philosophy and argue that, well, the individuals, these are the reasons why the unit is valuable. And so, as such, when we argue that we have a duty to bring a species back that we intentionally caused to go extinct, that makes sense because we're talking about the individual members of the species and not that we have a duty to an abstract concept of passenger pigeon, the ideal form of passenger pigeon. And so I'm going to pass through this because we've already been going through quite a bit of the material, and we don't need to go into ecosystem services. And we talked about how species can be valued for conservation already. So I'm just going to pass through that. But let's say that we are actively engaging with the question of justice. And if humans are responsible for bringing species back, if we've agreed and that we have a duty to bring specific species back, then many questions arise, such as the following. And these are just a few to kick off the discussion. Is all of humanity always the responsible party, or can it be specific groups, right? What if one group, like say North American citizens, caused an extinction or a specific community? Then does this hold for everyone? How far back does responsibility go? Does it precede modernity? What about, prehistoric extinctions? Who precisely are the eligible objects of the duty? Do all species count equally, or are there distinctions in respect worthiness? What level of human well-being justifies a waiver of the duty? Does humanity have a duty towards the smallpox virus and other viruses that we have eradicated, because that's technically an extinction? What is the de-extinction duty when the animal's natural habitat no longer exists, as in the case with the mammoth? And is there a subsidiary duty to restore the habitat too? And the questions go on and on and on here. And so we talked about the de-extinction debate, and we dipped our toes into some of the ethical issues, be that environmental concerns or concerns of environmental value and concerns about duty. And so I'm going to post this passenger pigeon video in case you're interested, and I'm also posting a video on the work being done to bring back the mammoth. But I'm very much curious what you guys think. Should we bring species back? And if so, which ones? And what are some of the environmental impacts? And what are some of the ethical impacts? And is this an appropriate application of assisted reproductive technologies? So thank you all very much, and I am looking forward to the discussion. And let me know if you have any questions, and I would love to talk with you guys about this during office hours as well. So thank you. Take care.